Good evening, everyone. I'm Lisa Henderson, Dean of the Faculty of Information and Media Studies at Western University, and I want to extend a warm welcome in what I know are really difficult times. I hope that you're healthy and safe, and I'm really glad that we have this platform. It's my privilege to open this occasion and pay tribute to the Clissold family, who have so generously supported the Clissold Lecture for a long time. First, though, our land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that Western is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenapehouk, and the Arawandran peoples, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. With this, I respect the long-standing relationships that Indigenous nations have to this land as their original caretakers. We acknowledge historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit endure in Canada, from pipeline appropriation to environmental and cultural racism in many forms. I accept responsibility as a member of our public institution to contribute toward revealing and correcting miseducation, as well as renewing respectful relationships with Indigenous communities through our teaching, research, and community service. The Clissold Lecture commemorates the life and work of Edward Clissold, who lived from 1833 to 1915. He was one of London's most important early editors and journalists. Edward Clissold retired as editor of the London Advertiser after 33 years on staff. A bequest in 1984 from the estate of Clissold's grandson, Robert Blount, and his wife, Rose Blount, enabled the then Graduate School of Journalism to found this annual lecture series to commemorate Clissold's legacy. The Clissold Lecture is one of the highlights of the year at Western, especially for the MMJC, or Masters in Media for Journalism and Communication program. It's an important opportunity for Canada's leading journalists to give Western and the London community a deeper understanding of the practice and critical importance of journalism in so many forms and on many fronts. We are not in a post-truth society, though there are such claims. Our commitment to complex truth and to the intersecting truths of many groups, not always obvious to each other and not always equal, is essential. For this, the practice of journalistic listening, writing, and knowing will serve us. Though it is not my privilege to introduce our speaker this evening, that goes to MMJC Graduate Program Chair Jeremy Copeland, I do want to acknowledge how much I've learned from Desmond Cole, most recently about policing and police defunding at Scholar Strike Canada, how much I've learned as a Canadian scholar and teacher returning to Ontario after decades in the United States. We need racial truths and storytelling with a conscience there and here and wherever we go. Following Desmond Cole's talk, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers. And for that, we'd ask you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please don't use the chat function. That has been turned off for the occasion. Jeremy Copeland will relay questions to Desmond Cole. Thank you, everyone. Again, welcome. And Jeremy, over to you.
Thank you, Lisa. And thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight, for the more than 200 people who are joining us from home. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Desmond Cole. And just so you don't think I'm just saying that because that's what you're supposed to say at these events and these moments, I want to tell you a little story. As Lisa mentioned, I am the chair of the Masters of Media in Journalism and Communication program at Western. And the program is now accepting applications for its 7th year, which will start in September. I've been trying to get Desmond Cole to talk to our students since the first year of the program. Among Desmond's many awards and recognitions is an honorable mention at the Canadian Hillman Awards. And I was at that event, the ceremony in Toronto in March 2016, when they celebrated his work in the Toronto Star and the Toronto Life. And in those stories, Desmond wrote about his personal experiences with the police practice of carding. The stories were powerful, they were personal, and they put a spotlight on how racism was built into the Toronto Police Service. that night at the Hillman Awards, there was a lot of people who were waiting to talk to Desmond and congratulate him. He probably doesn't remember this, but I managed to get his attention, say a quick hello, and introduce myself and tell him that I would be contacting him to see if he could talk to my students. Put in a little pitch right away. And over the next 5 years, we tried to make that happen, but the timing never worked out until 5 years later tonight. So it has been a long road. It's finally happening. And so when I say it does give me great pleasure to introduce Desmond Cole to you tonight, I mean it. So here we go. Desmond Cole is a journalist, an activist, and an author. He spent the last decade reporting and commenting on politics and social justice. He's very interested in the struggle for Black liberation within Canada. Desmond's work includes 10 years of local and national coverage, 5 years of radio broadcasting at News Talk 1010 in Toronto, a disruptive opinion column with the Toronto Star, and an award-winning magazine feature. His first book is the #1 national bestseller, The Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance and Power, and I highly recommend it. So wherever you are tonight, I think we're at more than 220 people joining us. Wherever you are, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Desmond Cole.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. I really appreciate you following up on that invitation from so many years ago. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you and to be delivering the Clissold Lecture this year. So, before I start, I would just like to say thank you to Jeremy and to your whole team at the Faculty of Information and Media Studies for making this evening's event possible, and to the Clissold family for continuing this annual tradition, which has given me an opportunity to come and speak about some things this evening that I feel very passionately about. And thank you to everybody who's tuned in to watch this evening as we continue to go through COVID times. And especially I want to say thank you to any journalism students who have decided to tune in this evening. This is like one of my most cherished opportunities is when I get to speak to and with journalism students, as we're going to do this evening, and to all the Black and POC journalists and Indigenous journalists who are watching this evening and who may not be watching, but who are struggling to find your way through school and perhaps into this industry. I just want to say welcome to you specifically and thank you. I want to start tonight by talking a little bit about something that happens to me on a regular basis, which may also happen to you, which is that as I go through COVID-19 and I read the news every day, I look at the news and I look at what stories are being shared. And if they have, I read about a whole bunch of different things, I guess, but obviously in this time that we're in right now, particularly, if there's seemingly new information or important, particularly like health and safety information that's related to COVID-19, I, like many people, want to click on that if it's online, and I want to see what's up, and I want to try and inform and educate myself about whatever the case may be. So, you see a headline, and the headline says, for example, that, are you really protected from COVID-19 in terms of like spreading COVID-19 once you become vaccinated? Can you still spread COVID-19 after you've been vaccinated? Really good question, really important question. Click on the newspaper article that is about this subject and get met with a nice big paywall that tells me that I have been selected to subscribe to the newspaper and that I can't actually read the information that I want to about COVID-19 because I don't have a subscription. So this happens to me a lot because I'm not a big fan of newspaper subscriptions for reasons that we can get into that are probably related somewhat to this talk. I'm often a fan of newspapers, but not always of newspaper subscriptions online, and certainly not a fan of paywalls. But I think that the idea during a pandemic that we must pay for information that could potentially be life or death information, That is what I have come to speak to you about this evening. When I entitled this talk, corporate media and objectivity in Canada, this is really at the heart of what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the idea of information as a commodity, of information not simply as something for free that we can all exchange, and that is accessible because we need it. I'm talking about information being primarily presented to us as a commodity that can be bought, sold, and traded. And that, of course, in the capitalist reality that we live in, what that means is that those who have the most resources will have necessarily the most access to information. The more that information is put behind a paywall, is put behind a subscription wall, is put on the third cable package that I can't afford, the less that information for me as a person is really useful. And of course, we could argue that maybe I should work harder so that I can afford all the cable packages and the newspaper subscriptions. And then I will be well informed about the world that I'm living in, and I'll be able to, protect myself better from coronavirus, et cetera. But the way that our country and that our world is set up is that it is not designed so that we will all have enough means to take care of ourselves, protect ourselves, have enough resources to go around. Our country is designed so that some people will have to be out working right now at the grocery store for minimum wage while there's a pandemic on, and that there will be people sitting at home whose wealth is accruing while they do nothing during the same global pandemic. That's the world that we're living in. And I think my biggest problem with the way we talk about journalism in Canada is that we pretend that journalism is somehow separate and apart from that capitalist, consumer, commodity reality, that journalism is the pursuit of truth and that it doesn't get affected by the pursuit of capital. And of course, that's nonsense. But that's what we're here to talk about this evening. I remember actually a point at which CBC News, I often run into paywalls at things like newspapers. Like I'm in Toronto, so I can use the Toronto Star as an example. I do not, you may be hard pressed to believe this, but I do not have a subscription to the Toronto Star. And so I don't get to read all of the free fun articles that I used to. However, we have a Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. It is still corporate, but it is paid for by all of us collectively and is supposed to be owned actually by all of us collectively. And there was a time at the beginning of the pandemic that I remember where CBC was like, we're actually going to provide free round the clock access to some of our news channels because we're in this emergency pandemic situation. And that was really eye-opening because it's like, well, why doesn't CBC always provide as the public broadcaster free and open access to all of its content? Why is CBC's content even sometimes paywalled or sometimes subscription-based only, right? I know it sounds maybe naive if we've never thought about this before. Desmond, people need to make money. Of course we need to make money. Do we need to make money more than we need to protect ourselves from a deadly pandemic? Do we need to make money more than we need the news as it functions on a daily basis outside of COVID-19 for our own health and safety and information about the political climate around us, the mundane, the weather, the lifestyle stuff, the sports? Of course, people have to get paid and we all have to eat, but we're living in a country where even during a pandemic, people don't get paid and people don't eat. So that imperative has to be questioned in our work as journalists at all times, because as nice as it would be for us to pay CBC so that they could have all the resources in the world, we're all supposed to collectively pay through the tax system. And then this public broadcaster is supposed to provide that information to us. But even CBC says like in March or April, hey, free content. And I don't even know when they took off the kind of like free live stream. You could just at one click of a button tune into CBC News for a while there on the internet. If you didn't have a TV subscription where you're paying through another cable company, right, which also owns another set of media and we'll get into that as well. But I don't even know when that free coronavirus kind of time period stopped, because CBC never really told anybody to my knowledge. They didn't make a big deal out of letting us know that, hey, this free window of content is over. Of course, coronavirus is worse now than it's ever been in Canada. So now you would think that they would have, brought that back or something. But of course, no. The motive for profit, the motive for exclusivity, where you have to give them something to get this content, the capitalist tease, the offer that if you had a little bit more, we could give you a little bit more. And if you have nothing, then you get less information, you get less access to content and potentially life-saving info. This is the problem, right? It's a problem because it reinforces the inequities that already exist in our world. And so when I talk about corporate media, I'm not just talking about, so I mentioned your cable. So who owns the media in Canada outside of, the CBC? In Ontario, we have TVO, public broadcaster, that again does create some very good content, but it's limited in what it is able to do. But who owns the media outside of those public broadcasters? Mostly in Canada, Rogers Communications does. Rogers owns like half of the media that we are consuming in this country that's corporate. Bell owns most of the rest of it. They just happen to be these huge telecommunications giants that also provide the means for you to access things like the internet, right? So it's a pretty sweet deal. Why do we believe that these companies have this journalistic obligation to tell the truth first and not to sell a product first, which is obviously what they do? They are a corporate media. And I want us to get past these very simplistic responses that say, well, are you saying that everyone in the corporate media only cares about money, that all your journalistic colleagues only care about making a buck for their corporation and don't care about the news? I haven't said that, of course. That's what people hear sometimes. And I am not trying to say that, of course. What I am saying is that the modus operandi, the reason for being of these entities is not to help you and I inform ourselves. And they're not going to go broke trying to inform us. But of course, even at that, the information that they provide through these media channels is a secondary pursuit to the business concerns of Bell Media, Rogers Communications, Torstar, and all the rest of them. Like, we can't even pretend like with CBC that there's some public interest mandate to corporations trying to sell us advertising through news and through information and through entertainment, right? This affects what they do as media. This affects what they cover and don't cover. This affects how they cover it. This affects whom they hire to cover it and what those people are allowed to say and do as part of their journalistic pursuit. All those things are limited by the corporate imperative, I will call it, that is at the top of delivering us that news. So it doesn't mean everybody's evil, but let's not pretend that the pursuit of journalism is interested in me first and not in making money first. That's not the case. And we don't have to have a debate about that, because you can go watch The Corporation, amazing documentary from early 2000s, and we can all talk about what a corporation is and what its function is. And I think we're past the point of pretending that, McDonald's and Bell Media and Pfizer are here to make me a better person and make you a better person. We know why they're here in our world, and the spillover effects of what they say they're doing are not enough to make up for the destructive, racist, white supremacist, patriarchal kind of base that they rely on to do business. So let's get into that a little bit. What is the kind of hallmarks, we could say, of corporate media? What does it do? Whether it's CBC, which is a corporation still, or a private entity providing us with media and information, what is it about corporate media that we can recognize and should be thinking about? Well, the corporate media's devotion is to making money, and so audiences come first. And when I say audiences, any creator of content and media can have multiple audiences. It's not a monolith and there isn't one. But the perceived audience of CBC or CTV or Global or News Talk 1010, where I worked for 5 years, or the Toronto Star, where I worked for a while, their perceived audience, and I'm saying this for many years in the industry, and I'm not saying anything I think that would be strange to anyone here, their perceived audience is a white Canadian born person who I think accepts certain things about their country. That generally speaking, Canada is a good and safe and democratic country. That's just assumed, right? That the institutions that we have in Canada may not be perfect, but they are better than maybe most places in the world, and that they should be critiqued and looked at and scrutinized through the lens that there's all kinds of bad places out there in the world, and we're better than all of them here in Canada. That's certainly a norm that our corporate media upholds, and it upholds a bias in general towards colonial institutions, to white supremacy. It upholds a bias towards patriarchy, and again, this notion of democracy, right? That these are all just a given in Canada and that we enjoy them and that they actually help us as journalists do our job. So while we cover elections, we don't question too much as journalists, for example, are our elections even really fair or representative? That's just an assumption of corporate media, because corporate media makes its money in this landscape. So how bad can it be, right? It's not, maybe it needs work, like I said, but the critique has to be limited because we don't want to critique the institutions that help folks make money and help put some of us at the bottom and keep the corporate bosses at the top. Another really important feature of corporate media, I think too, is the enforcement of the general norms of power in Canadian society within their own institutions. So to the extent that Canada is a society founded on colonialism, white supremacy, the erasure and genocide of Indigenous peoples, so are all of our institutions, including our media institutions. And that's why they look as white as they do in 2021. That's why the stories coming out of the media in 2021 continue to be so disappointing for so many of us. It's because the structure of our newsrooms and of our news institutions and our corporate media mirrors all of the biases and power imbalances and discriminations that already exist in Canadian society. And they want to keep it that way. They're not so interested in overhauling the systems that we have now and replacing them with new ones, because maybe they won't be able to make as much money in that new environment. This may sound crass. Again, if these aren't ideas that you're used to thinking about, it may sound like too hard of a condemnation of a whole industry. But I mean, this is what I think of our country. This is what I know about our country called Canada. So again, journalism that exists inside of this country doesn't get to escape the history of Canada, the usurping of land, culture, and resources from Indigenous peoples in this settler colonial state that we call Canada, so that you and I can sit here and watch the news. That doesn't go away. We don't take that for granted. We shouldn't take it for granted, but corporate media tends to do that because it doesn't want to ask questions about its own legitimacy to operate here and to tell the stories that it wants to tell and to erase the stories that it doesn't want to tell. So I would invite you to ask yourself, how does what I've just said differ from how we are taught to think about media? Like, what do we imagine as being the news? What do we imagine as being journalism? Who do we imagine as being a journalist and a newsroom? What does our imagining of those things, how does it differ from the way that it actually works now? And more importantly, where do we get these ideas of what a journalist is or is supposed to be from? We get them from the same corporate media that I'm critiquing. So when you're a kid like I used to be, and you turn on the TV with your parents sitting there, and your parents watch the news and you watch the news with them, or my family used to listen to a lot of the news on the radio and still does. And so you listen to the news. You're consuming your own culture. You're consuming those norms and those entrenched power structures that I'm talking about. And they're telling you that journalism is a force for good, that journalism is getting to the truth, and that journalism, of course, at its best is objective. Okay? So what does objective journalism mean, and how is it really an impossibility within this corporate media landscape that I'm describing? There was a philosopher, I have my notes here and I have forgotten to note the name of the philosopher. It's Thomas Nagel, who in the 80s proposed this notion of something called the view from nowhere. And this was a critique of objectivity. And in Nagel's idea, you can't have what we call objectivity in journalism because you're always perceiving the world from your own subjective viewpoint. And so this applies much more broadly than journalism, of course. But when we say that the media should be objective, there's this notion of neutrality, I think. There's this notion of taking away all the biases that might taint the way that you look at a story, look at an individual, look at a circumstance or a political idea. Just get rid of all your biases and now look at it through a so-called objective lens. Impossible. We are our culture. We are 8-year-old me listening to the radio and absorbing all those notions of what journalism is supposed to be, and then looking out in the world in Canada and absorbing all of the things that I see in my culture, which is that Black people are the most poor. Black people live in the neighborhoods that are hardest hit by poverty. Black people aren't the people on TV reading the news to me every night or giving opinions to me about the news every night. Like, you can't escape that as a journalist who is raised in this country or who moves here from somewhere else and is trying to operate here. So objectivity proposes this view from nowhere, which is not only impossible, but really kind of antithetical to me to the purpose of journalism. Because if the purpose of journalism, as some have said, is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable, then I'm all for it. So in other words, these power structures that I keep talking about that exist within Canadian society, that reinforce racism, that reinforce heteronormativity, and that are very transphobic, right? That are ableist. If a journalist's job and the institution of journalism's job is to challenge those power imbalances and right them, well, I'm all for that kind of journalism. But what good is journalism if it just pretends that it doesn't know where the biases in society are and where all the power lies and says, who knows, maybe it's over here, maybe it's over there. I am not the one to say I am just the lowly journalist. Who does that kind of journalism serve? Archbishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa said that if you are neutral in a situation of injustice, then you've chosen the side of the oppressor. And I agree with that sentiment. There's no way in a world of suffering and economic imbalance and discrimination, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, there's no way to come into a world like that and look at it from a neutral perspective. If you're doing that, you're helping the people who are already on top, because essentially, again, going back to this idea that in journalism, we don't mainly challenge our systems and our power structures, well, then you're just leaving those imbalanced power structures intact and pretending that that's called objectivity. There's no such thing as objectivity, though. And I recommend for those of you who are interested in following up more on this, there's a really good podcast series and a book by Lewis Raven Wallace, a journalist, an independent journalist in the United States, who has a whole series called The View from Somewhere, which is also the name of Lewis Raven Wallace's book on this very topic. And I've learned a lot from their work. It's really excellent stuff. So sometimes I think we are asked, well, what's the better way? So you're saying, Desmond, that there's no such thing as objectivity. So is it like activist journalism then? What we need are activist journalists. Every journalist is an activist. Every single journalist is an activist. When a journalist wakes up in the morning and is scanning the wire and sees from the police that a child has been struck by a car, why would the journalist choose to put that story into their newscast and not leave it out for something else? They're making a decision. They're making a decision based, I'm sure, on viewership, because that's what corporate media cares about first and foremost, their audiences or their perceived audiences. But if I want to grant, what I would be doing in that situation, or what I know many people would be doing in that situation, a child being struck by a car and killed is unacceptable. It's a level of violence and everyday suffering for somebody walking down the street that we cannot accept as human beings. It's outrageous. We don't like it. We don't want children to be struck by cars. So the idea that you're not being activist when you run that story at the top, there's nothing beaming down from God telling you that that's the lead story that day. You're using your own subjective judgment and opinion to decide that that's what people need to hear about for X and Y reasons. And that's what we're always doing as journalists. And that's why hiding behind this notion of objectivity is, to me, so morally bankrupt and dangerous. Because usually this notion of objectivity comes up when we want to defend things that we're not doing and talking about, through the notion that it would be biased to do so. And every Black person and every person of color, and probably every woman, every trans man and woman in journalism, every person with a disability who's in journalism, we've all experienced what I'm talking about when I say that the objectivity frame is used to dismiss things that might contribute to exposing those power imbalances that I keep bringing up. We've all experienced that. We've experienced it, for example, when we want to say something about the police, and because the newsroom's job is to have a good relationship with the police so that they can get their official news for the day, well, we're not allowed to ask that question or to make that critique of police, because that is seen as somehow being biased and subjective, as if the policing system itself is not a kind of safeguard of the white supremacist hellhole that we're all being forced to endure. It is. We have to critique the police as journalists. Again, comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. That would necessitate being really skeptical of the police. If you know anything about the history of police, if you know the difference between like what the police say that they do in Canada and what they actually do, you would have to be skeptical of them. But this frame of objectivity is brought in to say, no, it's not being objective when you criticize the police like that. There's just so many examples like this, I don't have time. The poppy, David Mastraki wrote an excellent piece recently about policies that newsrooms have for people on TV that force them to wear the poppy around Remembrance Day. I cannot think of a more political symbol intentionally than a poppy. And I don't think that displaying a political symbol is bad. I just think that if you want to wear your poppy, but I want to wear a Black Lives Matter pin, that those two things are equivalent political speeches. One of those things is not only encouraged by corporate newsrooms, it's mandated. If you don't want to wear a poppy, you can't go on as an anchor for CTV or CBC or any of these major broadcasters. They just won't let you come on the air. And that's because that poppy is reinforcing a political statement and reinforcing an institution, the military, which, as I mentioned, our corporate media institutions are comfortable with and see as being part of the normal course of things around here. So they want to pretend that that's not a place would be. This is how this goes when we have these frames. I'm getting a message here saying that my connection is having a bit of a problem. So I don't know if folks can still hear me, and if somebody can send me a message or jump in just to make sure that I'm
Desmond,
still.
you're good now. It was bad for a moment. We could hear you the whole time, and you're fine now.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much. I am getting close-ish to the end. I think other examples of this phenomenon that I'm talking about, the number of journalists that I know, Black journalists who have had to fight so that we can capitalize the word "be" in Black when we talk about Black people, and how that is a fight in every newsroom, and that in the 21st century, Canadian journalism standards don't tell you that you have to capitalize the "be" in Black, and that it isn't even something that we should be arguing about. Because when I talk about Black people as an identifiable group of folks, you capitalize that. That's like so obvious, but we have to fight for things like that as a Black person in the newsroom. And what's worse is that when we decide that we're going to make a big deal out of something that should be so simple and written into the rules for everyone, then we're seen as being undesirable in the workplace. We're seen as being the troublemaker, the activist. Here comes that idea of activism again, only applied to us, of course. Right? And these are the things that make it so hard to navigate this industry. And I hear this all the time from my colleagues. Things like comment sections that are very popular still to this day in many of these corporate media spaces, comment sections that are not moderated, and where all manner of disgusting hate and discrimination is being propagated. But, at the risk of offending white audiences who want to be able to have that content online, news media, corporate media in Canada will not take down those comment sections, because it's more important not to offend the racists than it is to hurt us with that kind of public commentary when we're just trying to read the news like everybody else. We have to be subject to that, because the audience that this so-called objective media industry prefers is the white racist audience that wants to have its say after every news article. It doesn't even add news value. Interestingly, CBC News actually, after Indigenous journalists and people in Indigenous communities fought for it, CBC News actually said, we're stopping all comments for stories about First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. So, that was seen as a victory, because now First Nations, Métis, and Inuit can log on to news stories on CBC that are about them and their communities, and don't have to worry about seeing this anti-Indigenous hatred online. CBC didn't do that for Black audiences. CBC didn't do that for any other group of people. The right thing to do, of course, would just be to cancel the comment sections, because they add more harm than good. But again, clicks, eyeballs, access to advertising, this is more important. That's the corporate agenda of media that becomes primary, more so than protecting those of us who are being subject to this hate. A colleague of mine told me today, a Black colleague told me that most of the Black people and people of color in the newsroom where she works have the worst working conditions in the newsroom. And what she means by that is that they are usually at the bottom in terms of tenure. So they will be part-time, temporary, occasional, seasonal, whatever you'd like to call it. But they don't have a full-time contract. They don't have benefits. They may not be full-time members of the union, full members of the union, right? Enjoying union protections. And that's true. That's my experience in Canadian media. And I want to end with a story about why I think that my colleague's observation is so important about this kind of low rung that we occupy in the ladder of Canadian corporate media. A really interesting decision came out of a labor arbitration today. Some of you may know what I am talking about. So I want to tell you the story as briefly as I possibly can, and then tell you why it's important to this conversation that we're having. You may remember not too long ago that, again, Remembrance Day, the poppy, an old white racist dinosaur named Don Cherry, who's been on TV, I believe, since before I was born. Don Cherry came on CBC's Coach's Corner, Hockey Night in Canada, and went on one of his rants about how, you immigrant people come here and you refuse to honor our traditions, which include wearing a poppy. It was a deeply racist rant, but it was nothing new for Don Cherry. A man by the name of Amar Khan, who was working for CBC in Manitoba, he had a problem with Don Cherry's commentary. Now, millions of us had a problem with it, but one of those people was Amar Khan. He was born in Canada, but his family is Pakistani. And so he decided to take to Twitter to respond to this racist rant by Cherry. And I want to read you what he said. He said, it is long due time for Don Cherry's Coach's Corner to be canceled. His xenophobic comments being aired weekly are deplorable. You know why Black and brown kids don't enjoy hockey? Because of the deep-rooted racism, which we get to hear every single week on national TV. So like all facts all the time, right? No lies detected here. The problem though was that Khan's manager at CBC Manitoba believed that he had violated the company's journalistic standards and practices by posting this tweet. And what she told him was that reporters are not paid to express our opinions, and that, you can't cover a story once you have expressed a personal view about it. So the person in charge of that journalistic standards and practices stuff at CBC agreed with Khan's manager and actually wrote that if Mr. Khan, quote, wants to be an activist, he should step down. And then this was the part that I really liked. He went on to say, everyone hears what they want to hear from Don Cherry. That sounds like an opinion to me. It actually sounds like the opinion of somebody who's saying, if you hear racism in Don Cherry's obviously racist garbage, that you're just wanting to be offended. It's very racist. And that's from the person in charge of journalistic standards at CBC. So why don't you resign, you dumb activist, and stop reading into Don Cherry's comments? This is the work environment that my friend is describing, that we all work in as people of color and as Black folks and Indigenous folks in this media environment. So Khan was asked to delete this tweet, and he didn't feel comfortable with that. And basically, before he even had an opportunity to delete it, it got more publication. There's a very reactionary, bigoted man out here in Toronto named Joe Warmington, who writes for The Sun, and he publicized Khan's tweet, which, flooded Mr. Khan with hate mail and got CBC, I think, even more embarrassed that he had been the one tweeting this stuff. Behind all of this, I must say, is this notion that when you work for the CBC, that even your Twitter feed is kind of like subject to their hand, right? That you can't just go off on your own and have this opinion, that it's necessarily, kind of implicating CBC, and that therefore you need to be careful. Now, what this means is that if you are in an environment at work where you're experiencing racism, like Khan is talking about a fellow CBC employee, Don Cherry, that the racist gets to have their opinion, but you do not. And once you express your opinion in response to a fellow colleague's racism, you are the one crossing the line, right? So this is a familiar story. Khan didn't delete the tweet. What he actually did was he went to other media and told other media, hey, my bosses at CBC are pressuring me to delete this tweet about Don Cherry, and I think that that's unfair and discriminatory. So Khan was subsequently terminated. A colleague of his went into his computer and found a whole bunch of messages, including messages that he was sending to people at other news outlets telling them, hey, CBC is requesting that I delete this tweet and they're coming down really hard on me. One of his colleagues found that on a shared work computer that he and Khan both used, and reported all of that to Khan's boss, and then he was dismissed from work. Now, there was a labor arbitration that the result of which was published just today about this whole situation. And it was a very, very interesting kind of decision. So all this time later, Amar Khan gets this labor arbitration about CBC getting rid of him over all of this stuff. So I just want to read a couple of things from that decision. The arbitrator said that even though Mr. Khan's laptop was shared, his failure to log out, because they could see his messages, is not an invitation to inspect his private messages. The inevitable conclusion is that Mr. Khan's right to privacy was violated. This was the very spicy, the tea is hot kind of part of this that I really stuck out for me when I was reading this decision. The arbitrator said, quoting here, many people might find it ironic and even amusing that a news organization that, as with any other major news outlet, is alerted to significant stories by sources who are granted anonymity would be surprised and indignant that one of its own employees used the same technique to give a story about the CBC to another news outlet. And the arbitrator said, I am one of those people who finds it amusing and ironic. The arbitrator went on to say that basically the manager, Khan's manager, and this other employee, Grabish, who spied on him and went into his computer to try and dig up dirt on him and found all of these things, that they were kind of violating his privacy. Not that they kind of were, that they absolutely were violating his privacy, and that they were, quote, seizing on Khan's messages and exaggerating their import in an effort to eliminate an unpopular employee. So they determined that the discipline against Khan was without just cause, but now the part that I came to tell you about for real, it says Mr. Khan, quote, is entitled to be reinstated to a reporter/editor position with no discipline on his record. However, because he was not a permanent employee, the CBC is ordered to offer to reinstate him only on a temporary basis for a minimum of the 4 months that he missed from his temporary position, end of quote. So when my friend and colleague talks about how Black people are all at the bottom, temporary, part-time, precarious workers, this is the result of that, is that we can be disposed of. Aman Khan was 23 years old and just out of school when the story that I just related to you happened to him in 2018. 23 years old. These are the conditions that we're finding ourselves in as Black people, as Indigenous people, and other people of color in the industry. And because we don't have tenure, when we report racism that we should rightfully be upset about having to work around, we have to fear for our jobs. And the racist corporate structure that wants to protect people like Don Cherry, it remains intact. Wendy Mesley says the N-word at CBC, and one of her Black colleagues has to risk her job, Imani Walker, to report that, yes, indeed, Wendy Mesley, you did say that word at work. And we have to put ourselves on the line and our careers on the line just to fight back against a level of discrimination that we should be well beyond by now. That's why we have to see what we do as journalists in this frame of corporate media. And that's why we have to reject the notions of objectivity that say that a racist old bag like Don Cherry gets to have whatever opinions, uninformed and bigoted as they are about us, and that us responding to that is somehow unprofessional, lacking in objectivity and judgment. This is what we're trying to overcome, like basic, decent working standards. And so to all the journalism students that I addressed at the beginning, if we don't have labor practices in this corporate media landscape, labor organizing is what I'm trying to say. If we don't have, whether that be like formal unions or other ways of organizing ourselves collectively so that we can fight back against the institutional discrimination that we have, we're in big trouble. You can't go into CTV or the Toronto Star, as I try to do, or any Bell Media shop or Rogers shop or wherever. You can't go into these places as an individual and try to negotiate with this massive multinational corporation about your job conditions. You can't do it. It's not going to work. And to the extent that we can't organize together, we're very powerless in these corporate media situations. I would never tell somebody not to take work in these situations, but I would say that we have to improve our lot as workers. That is my own, communist, socialist beliefs coming out and saying that like trying to take on the boss by yourself is just, that's not how we win, right? And I had an experience that maybe some of you know about where I had to leave the Toronto Star under similar circumstances to what I'm speaking about this evening. I was not a member of the union. I was not a full-time employee. I didn't have benefits. I didn't have a salary. I didn't have a union to protect me. And the union really was quite quiet at the Toronto Star, despite the fact that they weren't going to get disciplined in the way that I was being. And so in a corporate media landscape, we need workers to organize and take back the power that they have, and quite frankly, to control their content. Because when you work in a corporate environment, and this is the last thing I'll say, the corporation owns all of your ideas and creativity as a journalist, right? Far from this notion of the enterprising journalist who's out there seeking the truth that we're all brought up to believe in. When you go work for one of these corporations, they tell you where to be and when to be there. And when you express an idea, that idea becomes part of their operation. And you sign contracts saying things like this. And that's why they want to come after your tweets. That's why they don't want you to have even political opinion in your own spare time, because we own you and we own your thoughts and we own your content. And it better be in line with the dominant views that we're out here propagating, right? And so this is why organizing, labor solidarity, unionization, and fighting for better collective rights is like so important in this corporate media climate that we're in. There's obviously so much more to say and to talk about, but I really want to leave some time for students. Thank you again so much to Jeremy Copeland and to the team for making this lecture possible. Thank you to the Clissold family once again. Thank you to all of you for tuning in this evening and taking in what I have to say. It's an honor to do this with you.
Thank you, Desmond. That's so much food for thought there. Questions have already been coming in. I'm going to remind everybody to send in your questions in the Q&A button. Please keep them to questions. We don't need applause there because we're going to have lots of questions to look through, and Desmond and I want to be able to see them all. And we won't have time to get to all of them, but we can go a little bit later today. Desmond said we've got time to maybe go a bit later, so we'll go till about 8:15. Of course, if people need to leave, you can leave. That's easy enough to do without disrupting the whole room. It's one of the nice things about doing this virtually. Desmond, the first question I want to start with is Percy's question. Percy asks, or says that objectivity has been criticized as a guise for the performance of a kind of white masculinity that claims its power through denying subjectivity and situated knowledges. And then the question is, what are the possibilities and limitations of digital media in resisting, talking back to, and countering the view from nowhere?
I think it has to start in journalism school, which I actually never attended. I'm a university dropout, and I didn't plan on a career in writing and journalism. And I kind of backed into it through a lot of different experiences, but I was always kind of writing on my own. And it was the written word that really got me personally into journalism. And then after that, I started doing radio and other things, podcasts and the like. But, you know, the majority of people who are getting these jobs today have gone through journalism school at one point or another. And these ideas are just nowhere to be found in the education systems that are bringing up the new crop of journalists. And I have a big problem with that, which is why I get so excited getting to do talks like this, because I can speak directly to journalism students. If you get this kind of view from nowhere training as a journalist, and then you get into a corporate environment where it's just assumed that you know how to behave like this, it's like really hard to push back. I don't presume to like make anybody believe that going to work and fighting back against like entrenched biases is like super easy or an obvious or natural thing that you have to go and do. Like, it's hard. And we might not even be able to do it in most of the situations that we want to. Like, there are punishments for speaking back at work, including losing your employment. And we're all aware of that. But at least if in journalism school, we are being given this critique of the view from nowhere, then students can start to learn how to push back. Now, the trouble with that, of course, is that the people who are instructing in journalism school mostly carry these same biases. And that makes it hard because your teacher isn't going to want to instruct something that they weren't raised to believe and that might be actually threatening to the way that they themselves have practiced journalism or taught it, right? And so I think that it's very important to get our way into these education programs, and whether they be at the university level or at college. But I also just think that like it's a never ending slog against our institutions, including the media. The media, like every other corporation, had some big statement when a man in another country, y'all, got lynched on television, George Floyd. It was important for our corporate institutions, you know, universities, colleges, and the media to tell us all how upset they were about George Floyd. But they don't do that when somebody gets murdered by the police in our own country here. They don't say even the names or do basic reporting that would honor the lives of people who are murdered here by the police. They don't do it in the way that they're capable of doing and with the kind of sustained vigor that's necessary to challenge policing and white supremacy. So even if you have that opportunity to think about these things in school, and even if you maybe read about them and think about them on your own, it's still going to be hard to try and implement that in a place that really doesn't want you to say and think and practice those things, which is why I go back to our need to form collective responses and to really organize and unionize and fight back with a collective voice. And then that means that white folks, and, you know, particularly white men who have the easiest time getting in the door of this media, that's an opportunity for you too, to unionize with your colleagues and to say, like, in our union, these are the things that matter. Fighting against transphobia in the workplace and ableism matters, even if it's not affecting my life directly. Fighting back against the patriarchy that exists in our newsrooms and the sexism and the disgusting conditions that many people have to work under, that's my responsibility in an organized and unionized environment, even if I'm not directly dealing with it. We have to be able to come together to support and learn from and listen to and like amplify one another.
Thanks, Desmond. Next question is from me, actually, just following up on your comment. For journalism schools, what would you suggest that they should be doing to prepare BIPOC journalists and their allies when they're going out to work in the kind of environments you're talking about? How do we prepare our students for that?
I think that actually this isn't maybe thought of so much, but I think that the schools of journalism in my ideal world would actually be putting a lot more pressure on employers. And saying that, like, you know, these are the things that we're hearing from students. These are the things we're hearing from graduates when they try to get into your institutions. This is the racism. This is the homophobia and the discrimination, the use of objectivity to silence non-dominant views. Now, again, the institutions of higher education would actually have to believe in those things before they were going to start talking to a corporation about it. And I am sorry to say in Canada that, let me give an example. So every school in Canada had a, you know, George Floyd, we're sorry kind of publicity statement and performative allyship with Black folks. But how did George Floyd die? He was murdered by the police in public. Every day on our campuses, Black students are stalked by campus police and campus security. But not one institution in this country said, we're going to respond to what happened to George Floyd by protecting Black and Indigenous and other POC students on our campuses by getting rid of campus police and campus security. And as is always the case in these situations, the safety and comfort of white people is always set up as being against that demand to get rid of police and security. Well, how will we all, meaning white people, be safe if we don't have the campus police and security to call anymore? Never mind that unnecessary force is being used to ruin our experience as Black people on campus, including instructors, by the way, including people in faculty and administration who have to put up with the same racist conditions that their students have to put up to, including the staff who are non-faculty staff at these institutions. So I would like to believe that our institutions of education could lead the way in talking to these corporations and saying, we're providing the education that's going to send these young folks into your ranks one day, but you're not living up to the values that we believe in. You got to practice those values as in university institution or college institution before you start telling other people to do the same thing. And I just see absolutely no will on the part of our schools at this point to even begin to take white supremacy seriously. So that is a challenge that I continue to lay down, because as I say that workers inside of the journalism institution have to fight, students and professors within the white supremacist education institutions of Canada have to fight back inside of their institutions. Me being here tonight is not magically going to make racism go away at Western. So we have a lot of work to do.
If only it was that easy. A couple people asking the same question, which is, what would be the best way to organize and unionize in the current corporate media landscape?
Having never been a member of a media union, this is not the most straightforward question for me to explore, and to respond to. The Canadian Media Guild helped Aman Khan file the labor arbitration complaint that I just raised. So that is one example. But I think that the challenge is that, like, having to go and fight to get a job back, like, who wants to go back to CBC, for example, after you've had the experience that this young man has had? It's like the remedy comes too late, right? So even when you have union support that says, okay, we're going to like fight back against what happened to you, that can't undo the unfair punishment that's already been handed out. So sometimes unions do good work and do support people. I find that, again, that's usually not the case, and that even in our unions, we have to fight racism from the bottom up, and that people in unions tend to be white male leadership and tend to reinforce all of these things. They tend to tell Black and other racialized and Indigenous employees to settle their cases rather than take them through to courts and to arbitration. Just like, let's come to a deal with the other side. Maybe what happened to you wasn't so bad. I see and I hear that in Canadian media regularly. And again, like, I could have spent my entire talk, just thinking about people from, Supriya Dwivedi to just like Vicky Machama, to people who should have in the upright world that I imagine, people who should have like a prominent place for the work that they've done in Canadian media, but have to leave certain spaces because those spaces are not accommodating of them and giving them really the platform and the latitude that they deserve to do their work. So how do you unionize more effectively? I think it's important that people who are in unionized environments begin to lead those conversations more. But again, as I said, when I was at a newspaper that had a union, they didn't exactly show leadership when I was told that I was breaking the, sacred rules of objectivity. People didn't feel comfortable speaking up for me. And I think that there have to be a lot of difficult internal conversations about why that is and what the real purpose of the union is supposed to be. Now, there is a freelancers union that tries to help freelancers chase after our invoices that aren't being responded to 30 and 60 days later. And I think that's good, but it's a kind of base form of protection that is clearly not enough. Some of you might have heard of Scholar Strike, and Scholar Strike was referenced at the beginning of this. You know, we have to be in a constant struggle for our kind of better conditions and better livability as working people. That's just basically what it comes down to. And we have to be in solidarity with other people who are fighting the same fight. And I know that being in an industry that preaches objectivity all the time might not lend itself to you feeling like I'm going to be this big union activist. But if you don't, when you're an inconvenient person in the newsroom anymore, that's what's going to happen, is that you're just going to be flicked away. And we can't afford to see that happening to people.
Thanks, Desmond. I've got two questions I'm going to read to you. One is from Alessia, who's one of our current students in the program, and one is from Yara, who's applying to be in the program next year. And they're both quite similar. So Alessia says, you speak in your book about how you are hailed to present your Blackness in Canadian corporate media, but those same outlets punish you when it crosses their lines. How do you think future journalists can combat this and push back against these standards and expectations? And Yara's question is more about herself, but as a Palestinian, she says—
sorry. Can I just hold you there, Jeremy? Because I won't be able to hold both questions in my head at the same time. So
go ahead.
About the answer for
one.
I'll come back to the second question. I did mention in my book about how the Toronto Star, it wanted my diversity, but not my Blackness. The day that I debuted as a columnist in the Toronto Star in 2015, they put me on the front page. They had a little banner across the top that announced that I was a new columnist there. I bought that newspaper off the newsstand. You know, I was thrilled. And it was an exciting time for me. And then within 8 months, I was kind of being summoned into the Toronto Star by John Honderick, the acting publisher, and he was telling me, you're writing about race too often. It's been 3.5 years, and even thinking about him saying that to me is still as infuriating today as it was when it happened. But that's what I mean when I say that they want diversity. So they want to show a Black face to add to their ranks. And, you know, I say it's like Pokemon, right? Because the slogan for Pokemon is gotta catch them all. And I think that that's how they treat us as Black and Indigenous and POC in Canadian media, is that they want to put something in the front window to show that they're about it, that they're understanding the times, that they're changing with the times. But then behind the scenes, they're muzzling and discouraging and intimidating those same individuals who they're putting up in the front window. How do we as journalists combat this? Again, it's not up to us as individuals. We're coming into a system that has these biases ingrained in it, and that is part of a country that is being held together by these power imbalances. So it is not up to the individual journalist to come in and start knocking down all of these pillars. We do what we can as individuals, but it's really not until there is a greater labor demand. So Wendy Mesley at CBC says the N-word and somehow is like still, seems like Wendy Mesley still has a job. I don't know what she does now, since I haven't seen her on the air for months, but she still has a CBC Twitter and is still tweeting from it. So like, until people like that can't be so secure in their positions after engaging in racism on the job, like, we have a lot of work to do. But why is Wendy Mesley so secure in her work? Is because there's a whole cadre of people around her who have power, who are like, no, you're not going to have accountability for what you did. Maybe the people who report you will have accountability before you have it, Wendy. And we're not going to be allowed to rise up in the ranks when we are openly critical of that kind of a regime and want to change it. They're not going to be like, yeah, come on in and tell us what we're doing wrong. And why don't you have my job, right? Like, so it's about coming into, I think, the industry with a sense that part of our job as journalists is to address these structural problems, and that whatever time and devotion we're doing to the work day to day, that work day to day is necessarily intertwined with these problems of systemic discrimination, and that we're going to devote part of our labor as workers to addressing that, because they're not looking to, guys, everybody now has a consultant. That's the new thing that they're doing now. It's not so new, but again, with the George Floyd stuff, it's like now we're going to bring in Black people to consult or to be an assistant to this person who will advise them about issues of diversity. Some media organizations like the Toronto Star have created like a diversity position for somebody, right? So that, you know, white management is like, I'm so tired of hearing about all these complaints of Black and brown people. I'm going to hire somebody to have to listen to those complaints so that I don't have to do it. And we'll call that progress. It's actually quite incredible, the performative nature of our industry and how it always tries to escape accountability. But there's no easy answer there. We have to commit to, as I said, part of our job as journalists being to address these systemic challenges in the work that we do, in the stories that we report on and create, but also in a labor relations with power and relationship with our bosses kind of environment.
Thanks, Desmond.
Sorry, and I know you have something, and I just wanted to say something too. I didn't really say enough about independent journalism versus activist journalism. You know, and people ask me, "Are you an activist or are you a journalist? Are you an activist journalist?" And I want to be an activist journalist, Desmond. Just remember that every journalist is an activist, and that the key distinction that I think we might be making is independent journalism. I've had a blog for more than 10 years. I've never made any money off of my blog. I've never put up any advertising on my blog. And even if I did, I mean, I'm not against those things in principle if other people are doing those things. But what I'm saying is that the kind of pursuing a corporate motive is not the only way of pursuing journalism. And that I think that the key distinction is not whether you're activist or not, it's whether you belong to a corporation and they own your ideas and your time and your Twitter feed, or whether you can do your journalism independently of those forces and not have to deal with their finger in your work every day. So I do wanted to make that distinction before we ended.
Thanks, Desmond. I'm going to fire one more question at you, and then we're going to wrap up. There's some great questions here. I wish we could go on forever, but I want to thank everybody for asking their questions, and I'll do that afterwards. So Desmond, last question I'm going to send your way is, as a BIPOC journalist, I've managed to get a job covering marginalized groups, and I've have been pushed bosses to hire more journalists of color with success. Expanding coverage, challenging white supremacist ideology, leading initiatives in my white newsroom to diversify guests and narratives. I feel like I have an opening with my managers, and I do not want to squander it. What else can I do?
I mean, sounds like you're doing a lot. And I think it's great that you're having some success. And often, depending on who we're working with, people can be more or less receptive to our attempts at making change. And I think that that's why we have to try, no matter what kind of environment we are in, or no matter how like difficult it seems like it is to do that. So I was part of a group recently, and we were talking about media, and we were kind of doing a little bit of like media literacy stuff. And this was mostly folks on the East Coast in places like Halifax and New Brunswick. And it was a really interesting and good like community conversation led by people like Lynn Jones in Halifax. And what I remember about that conversation is that like we were kind of strategizing and asking questions exactly like this one about like, how do we do more, and how do we push, and how do we make changes? And one thing that occurs to me, again, that's really popular right now is making content that is specifically about us as Black people. So we're going to have a race and diversity reporter, or we're going to have a special. Everybody's doing specials now. The great thing about specials is that they're special, so they don't happen all the time. So we can silo people of color and Black folks and our concerns and our struggles to live into a 1 hour special. And then we can point at it and say, hey, we spent a lot of money on that, and we spent a lot of resources on that, and you can't criticize us now because we did our Black special. But then there's 364 other days of the year where Black people are apparently not special and don't need this kind of focus and coverage. So what I would say is it's very important for us to focus on normalizing the idea of talking about white supremacy and talking about a racial justice struggle on the day-to-day. And that people of color in the newsroom don't have to write about those issues if we don't want to. We don't have to report on them if we don't want to. If we do want to, I think we should be encouraged. But that it doesn't have to be siloed, and it ought not to be. And that you actually are doing such a disservice to even just, I'll take my own folks as an example. You're doing a disservice to the diversity and the richness that is Blackness in Canada if your only attention to it is just the 1 hour special. You can't cover us in an hour. And you don't have to create a separate beat to cover us like we're under a microscope in your newsroom. You can just make a concerted effort to talk to more Black people and put us in the news. I'm fascinated that I never saw, the lazy journalist loves a streeter. You go out and go to Nathan Phillips Square. I know we can't do these things in COVID times, but you just stick a microphone in front of some people and ask them to react to a question about something that's going on in the news. It's not always the most easy kind of endeavor. So I'm kind of joking when I say the lazy journalist loves it, but I mean, it's accessible when you do these kinds of journalism. When we were talking so much about the issue of police carding and Black people's apparent civil rights that we don't actually enjoy in Canada being summarily violated by the police through this practice of carding, which continues every day in Canada, by the way, I never saw a journalist just do a streeter. Just go up to Black people in Nathan Phillips Square, or imagine going to Scarborough or North York or somewhere that is not downtown Toronto and asking Black people, tell us about your experiences being stopped by the police. I never saw one of those, and I've still never seen one of those. And that strikes me because it's not hard to do, and it's honest, and it gives you a sense of what people are thinking and gives people a little bit more of a voice than they have. But it requires mostly white journalists who are employed by news outlets to put themselves in an uncomfortable and maybe unpredictable situation by having to talk to strangers who are Black. And I think that our media industry doesn't like to admit that it's not even really comfortable doing things like that. But then you want to do a 1 hour special on Black people when you can't even go and speak to us in the street about a practice that's affecting our day-to-day lives. So I think that's something to think about, is how we integrate these conversations into the day-to-day of the newsroom and of the editorial room and of the videography and of the radio report, rather than just making it special on Black people so that we can then go back to forgetting about our lives.